this isn't necessarily the first of our study groups or these Q&As that we've hosted, but this is the first one that we've hosted and we've opened up to the general public. And one of the things that came up today is I've been off of Twitter for a while, and I just got back on today to just see what's going on in the Twitterverse. And I saw a friend of mine, Sam Reynolds, make a post about the whole Saturn and Aquarius and Uranus comment, and how that is a thing within people's minds still, and how that is something that is still being discussed today in astrology. And that led me to wanting to have this space available for people to ask questions about that. And truthfully, the entire time that we're going to spend together isn't necessarily going to be about that singular question, because it is a question in people's minds. I figured that it would be a good thing to open up a platform to talk about it, because it's a topic that I feel has gotten a lot of airtime, lol, talking about Aquarius, but it's a topic that I feel has gotten a lot of airtime, but apparently, I don't know, we haven't heard the full story about it. So anyway, I'm opening up this space for us to have a conversation about that as one of several questions that I'm sure you're going to ask. And when we bring up this topic of the ancientness of rulership, what we're fundamentally also saying is that the entire schema for things that rule things, i.e. planets that rule signs in astrology, is something that has always been a part of tradition, and is something that goes as far back as the Babylonian period, when we look at the ancient Babylonians speaking about the planets who have their exaltation in whichever signs. So we have the ancient Babylonians saying things like Saturn has its exaltation in Libra, and Mercury has its exaltation in Virgo, and Venus, ironically, one of the things they said was that Venus had its exaltation in Leo. So we have this concept of rulership being very ancient, and then we have this other concept of essential dignity is also being a part of the antiquity of our astrology. And when we speak about the antiquity of astrology, what we're fundamentally really talking about is an astrology based on things that were humanly observable in an unaided fashion. And by unaided fashion, we're speaking about, what does this cosmos look like to me? What does nature look like to me without any advanced technological tools that allows me to pair beyond where the limitations of my physical human apparatus allows me to look? And that's the primary thing in terms of us having an internal orientation towards an ancient astrology. This realization that for the ancients, they were looking at what was observable within their cosmos from their perspective of nature here on Earth. And when I say the word coming up with, it feels as if it's a little bit contrived and quote unquote made up. And then there's another topic with, if it's made up, does it actually make it wrong, or does it actually make it incorrect? But that's an entirely different rabbit hole. But the entire thing with this becomes that this topic of rulership is based on a humanly observable universe unaided by technology. And this concept was in place long before the discovery of Uranus in the year 1781 by William Herschel and his sister Caroline Herschel. So in 1781, the discovery of Uranus, it did have this impact of expanding our notion of who the constituents of our universe and of our cosmos actually was. But it didn't change the internal harmonies that existed and that pre-existed that discovery of Uranus. And the internal harmonies within our astrology are based on the 7 classical planets. And those 7 classical planets are called the Chaldean order. Chaldean because one of the terms for the ancient Babylonians was the Chaldeans. And so this concept of rulership goes back to those 7 classical planets. Now, when we use the word planet in astrology, we're fundamentally speaking about moving bodies or wanderers, going back to the ancient Greek derivative of the word planet, which means wanderers. So from our Earth-based perspective, everything within the Chelum being Latin for sky, everything within the Chelum moved. This is something that we know. If you're standing on an immovable Earth, then that means that the entire sky, the entire vault of heaven, the entire firmament is moving around you every day as the Earth makes its rotation on its axis, which causes the 24-hour cycle of the day. However, from our Earth-based perspective, we're not the ones that are moving. We look out at the sky and we see the sky moving around us. So everything moves in that Chelum, including the sun and the moon, which is why we're characterizing the sun and the moon as planets within this Chaldean order. So for the ancients, our planets were from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Moon. That was the be-all and the end-all in terms of the 7 governors or the 7 rulers or the 7 old gods from our ancient classical astrological perspective. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And beyond Saturn, the ancients thought was the realm of the fixed stars or the sphere of the fixed stars. And beyond that sphere of the fixed stars, the ancients thought was the sphere of the prima mobile meaning the prime mover, or who is it that causes the sky to move in the first place? Who is it that causes these planets to be in their specific orbits? Who is it that gives this movement to everything within the cosmos that allows the entire Chelum of heaven to rise in the east every day and set in the west every day? And throughout the day as well, because we know that from our perspective, the sky is continuously rising in the east and setting in the west at every given moment of the day. So who is it that initiated that? For the ancients, that was the primum mobile, i.e. the prime mover. And there are many ways in which we can anthropomorphize that being and call that being God. Whatever we choose to call that prime mover, there are many terms for that. But the foundational term is prima mobile, i.e. the prime mover that's causing all of these movements to take place. So that is the ancient cosmos. That is the cosmos according to the ancients. But for the ancients, they did not have the tools in order to see beyond the point of Saturn. So when we speak about our concept of rulership and how things are ruled and how the fundamental philosophy of astrology comes about, it comes about based on this fundamental concept of what is visible. And what is visible is up to Saturn. Beyond Saturn is the realm of the fixed stars, the firmament. And in the Bible, we know this thing where it says that, and God separated the waters above from the waters below, and he placed a firmament between them. So this firmament essentially is the realm that's beyond Saturn, and that's where we find our fixed stars. And then beyond that fixed stars is something completely unbeknownst to us, and therefore that became the realm of the primum mobile. So that's the cosmos within which our entire astrology has to get built. And the whole point, essentially, the whole point of me saying all of this is that if you only have these constituents of the universe to work with, then you can't seek for rulership anywhere else other than these constituent factors. So there can't be something beyond the prima mobile that rules one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, because from our perspective, this is all there is. And if this is all there is, our entire field of astrology has to be built within the framework of all there is. And all there is are these 7 planets: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. Beyond that, the fixed stars. Beyond that, the unknowable. So that's the framework within which our astrology is built. And I'm going to show you a diagram of the Thema Mundi as well, so that we can see how this gets laid out in terms of a classical perspective of rulership. But even beyond that, I think our primary understanding should be and has to be that before the discovery of anything else within the cosmos, with the discovery of Uranus in the year 1781, our entire understanding of what astrology was and where astrology came from and what are the main players within the field of our astrology was already established. Now, this doesn't go to say that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are of no effect. And I think that this is the place where we fall within our astrology today, because we think that the conversation is an either-or conversation, that we either give Uranus rulership of Aquarius or we don't use it at all. And for me, from my perspective, as a traditionally trained astrologer who uses Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, I don't necessarily think that that's the right approach. I don't necessarily think that we have to be so split within our astrology that it has to be an either or. Either we give Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto rulership within the zodiac, or we don't use them at all. I don't necessarily think that that is the right approach, and I actively don't think that that's the right approach. But I don't think that the flip is true, where it is that they need to be the rulers of signs in order for them to be valuable. And I have many colleagues, many traditional astrology colleagues who use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, who feel the same way, that they don't have to be rulers in order for them to be powerful. And this is the greatest takeaway, that if you take away anything from this conversation today, that you take this away, that they don't necessarily have to be rulers in order for them to be powerful, or in order for them to have an impact within our astrology. So when we speak about the planets up to Saturn, we are essentially speaking about the planets with which we can look to in terms of them having some relationship to our earthly experience down below. Because we can see up to them, they can see down to us. We can see up to Saturn, Saturn can see down to us. So from that perspective, these planets up to Saturn still fall within our terrestrial understanding of what are the factors that fundamentally allow us to have a basic, stable shape of life on Earth down below. However, it takes a quantum leap of technology on our part to see Uranus. Neptune was discovered using mathematics, and so was Pluto. So it takes these quantum leaps beyond our human capability, in which we need to be aided by technology, great amounts of technology, in order for us to see Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto within the sky. And so from the perspective of my philosophical understanding of things, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are extraterrestrial to our human experience and to our human understanding. So when I think about the terrestrial plane, for me, the terrestrial plane isn't just this Earth that we're on, but it's these planets up until Saturn. So from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and Earth, that is the plane of our Earth experience. But when we go beyond that threshold of Saturn, which is why I love this imagery and this mythology of Saturn as being a god of the boundaries and Saturn as being a god of the threshold, because essentially Saturn is the threshold between our known and knowable universe and that which lies beyond. Because you can't see beyond Saturn is really the whole point of this conversation. So when we have this concept of Saturn being the boundary of the known, the knowable, the safe, the secure, the certain universe, we realize that anything that's beyond Saturn is something that causes us to have to move beyond our own humanity in order to understand it. For that reason, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they represent concepts that are beyond our human safety and concepts that are beyond our human security. So the traditional astrologers who I'm colleagues with, who also use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, in general, if they had to characterize them within our ancient classification of planets as being either benefic planets, life-supporting planets, planets that are nutritive and supportive of the life of humanity, versus malefic planets, planets that are destructive or not specifically supportive of the life of humanity, the benefic planets fall within our classical model of benefic and malefic. But Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, on the other hand, in general, because of the, what's the word? Because of the level from which they operate, and because of the level at which they exist, they aren't necessarily, quote unquote, life supportive planets. They don't necessarily support the life of anything, because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto represent three different types of extraordinary change that are beyond our human status within the universe. Now, at this point, people usually tend to feel very uncomfortable with this conversation, because what we've done in the 21st century is we've taken the entire cosmos and we've mapped it onto ourselves, because we have birth charts that matter a lot to us, and we want to feel a personal connection to those charts. And so if you have gone through life thinking that your sun is in Aquarius and therefore you're Uranus ruled, and now you're hearing that, Uranus doesn't really care about us at all, neither does Neptune, neither does Pluto, it hits a raw nerve, because we've spent so much of our personal time and energy investing in personalizing the sky, that we haven't realized that there is a level at which, if we step back, this entire situation isn't even about us. And I think that's the piece that I really want to go into now. The way in which, if we took a meta approach to astrology, where we weren't so personally engaged in it, we didn't really come to astrology always thinking about our charts, but we came to astrology thinking about these titanic forces of nature on their own terms, then we realized that it really isn't about us. And anything that's said about Uranus isn't necessarily said as a personal affront to you specifically, but it's said about the internal life of a planet on that planet's own terms, based on what we've observed about how that planet operates down below. So when we say that a planet like Uranus is invested in things like great change and upheaval and breakthroughs and breaking free and letting go of the shackles of societal understanding and being completely avant-garde and moving away from society, we're completely speaking about something beyond the realm of Saturn, which is an important concept for us to speak about. But it's beyond the realm of Saturn, which means that from the level of Uranus, Uranus doesn't necessarily care about our individual human lives. Because if we use this analogy of us being able to see the planets as being an important thing and as being fundamentally important for the ancients, us being able to see up to Saturn and Saturn being able to look down at us meant that Saturn, within the life of Saturn, even though we call Saturn cold and dry and the bully and all of the things we call Saturn, there's still something within the heart of that Saturn that can see us and therefore knows we're here and therefore has the internal ability to also care about us. Uranus, when we look up to the sky, we don't see Uranus. When Uranus looks down, it's probably likely that Uranus doesn't see us. So we say, oh, this Uranus causes quote unquote earthquakes. Uranus doesn't realize that it's your specific house that's being burned down, or is your specific house is being broken down through that earthquake, because Uranus is operating at such a level, at such a titanic level within nature, that it really doesn't even realize that we're here and that we're getting pushed around by its movements. I think about this like when we're going through our lives, just walking down the road, and how many of us have walked on an ant without necessarily realizing that that ant was there to be walked on? Or how many of us have accidentally hit down, and I'm sorry, I'm talking about ants because ants just seems like the most relative or the most appropriate point of discussion. Like how many of us have hit down one of those ants' nests, basically, without realizing that that was something that we were doing, or without realizing that we were actually stepping on an ant's nest? Many of us, I surely have stepped on a couple of ants' nests within my life without realizing that it was there. And so I think that when we take a look at Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as these extraterrestrial planets, from the perspective of them not being able to see us in the same way as we aren't able to see them, then we have to also take into perspective some of the things that we say about those planets, especially from a societal level, when there's a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, or when there's a Uranus-Neptune conjunction, like the one that happened in 92, or when there's any of these massive planetary movements of these planets and how they also mark massive upheavals down here on Earth. Can we say that it's because they, as sentient beings, can understand what's happening down here below, or that they're just moving as they do, and as a result of their movements, we receive the quote-unquote backsplash of it? Now, I realize that that wasn't the most eloquent way to put that, but the whole point is that we see up to Saturn and we don't see beyond. So Uranus doing something within the cosmos isn't necessarily that thing being done to us, but that's something within the movement and within the life of that Uranus, which is independent to it using us as a point of reference, similarly to Neptune, similarly to Pluto. Now, this has gone down a rabbit hole, and I really want to show the Thema Mundi as being the basis of where we root this conversation. Yes, Tina?
I just wanted to say that's a really good explanation. I know there's been many times in modern astrology where looking at a chart and you say, oh, well, here's Pluto. And someone will say, that's a universal planet, it doesn't matter, which didn't mean anything to me when I first started studying astrology. And also that's a really good basic and understandable explanation for planets that are also classified as transpersonal. So I just wanted to put that out there because that brings all that to a really understandable level.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tina. And I mean, really the point with this, and one of the reasons why they're called transpersonal, is one, they take so long within their individual orbits. And so that's a major factor. So we can't really personalize the Uranus, the Neptune, the Pluto in the same way as we can personalize Saturn, which is taking 29.5 years in its orbit from our geocentric perspective, or Jupiter, which is taking 12 years in its orbit from our geocentric perspective, and those being more longer range things. So granted, this whole concept of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and them being the giants and us being the ants, that's something that I've come to within my own astrological philosophy within myself. But that is also a level at which I understand those planets from a traditional astrology perspective, that they're still valid components, they're still valid constituents of our sky, and therefore also valid constituents of our astrology. But how valid are they really in terms of the rulership's topic is a completely different situation. So here's a diagram of the Thema Mundi, and I'm pretty sure that this is one of the, I Googled Thema Mundi and I found this, and I'm pretty sure that this may be from Chris Brennan or something, but I'm actually not sure where the location comes from because it just comes from anywhere online. So I'm just saying that as a disclaimer, this is not an Oraculos diagram, but this is just something that I Googled. So with the Thema Mundi, what we have on the outside are essentially the 12 signs of the zodiac, which we are knowing. And we also have within those signs the 7 planets, which are the Chaldean order of the planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. Now, before we go on, I think it's important for us to take a look at the word zodiac and realize that the concept of the zodion essentially is a concept of a living being. And we've always called, or within traditional astrology, we call the 12 signs of the zodiac the domiciles or the houses of the planets. But this suffix of eon has to do with location. So we have the Olympion, and we have all of these words that end in ION, which have to do with the location of something. So this zodion is essentially isn't just a living being within itself, but it's a location of a living being, which makes even more sense when we take into consideration the fact that the word domicile, meaning home, is the home of the planets. So we say that Cancer is the domicile of the moon, but what we could equally say from this understanding of Zodion being this, or rather Zoidion being this temple of a living being, Cancer is therefore the temple of the living being that is the moon. So it's just an internal shift, because we tend to only think about the signs of the zodiac as places or as placeholders, but they're both the domiciles of the planets, and as the domiciles of the planets, they're essentially the temples of the living beings that we call the planets. And the planets are, from this perspective, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. So we have the Thema Mundi starting with Cancer. And Thema Mundi starts with Cancer because the Thema Mundi is essentially the birth chart of the world, if we could imagine such a thing. And we know for several reasons why this cannot be the case, because it's just, you know, Mercury could never be that far from the sun. Mercury can never be 2 signs away from the sun in this manner, because Mercury is having an elongation from the sun of 28 degrees in zodiacal longitude. So it couldn't possibly be 2 signs away from the sun as it's represented here. And there are some other considerations with the Thema Mundi and the degree that it starts at, but that's one of the overarching points that says that, hey, this is just a made-up diagram to describe a concept, not necessarily the actual birth chart of the world. But if we were to think of this Thema Mundi as being the birth chart of the world who we've implanted with this feminine quality of being our mother, or of being Gaia, or goddess of the earth, this world that we've implanted with this passive quality, Kabbalistically saying that the world, this realm, this kingdom of earth, is essentially the bride of the eternal, then it makes sense for the Cancer to be here on the first house cusp of the horoscope of the world, because we know that the first house represents the native. The first house represents you, your psychology, your intellect. It represents all of these things within traditional astrology, but more so it's representing the soul of the person. So this is the house of the soul of the person to whom the chart belongs, essentially. So for the birth chart of the world, the first house gets the designation of belonging to Cancer, because Cancer most represents the soul of the earth as mother. Cancer being a sign that we've always associated, for all intents and purposes, with mothering and the maternal, and even in the physical body, Cancer is having to do with the breasts, and it's having to do with the ways in which the breasts are one of the components of this mothering, nurturing archetype that we've superimposed onto our concept of Cancer. So the ancients said, since our entire concept of how things came to be has to start with the moon being the womb, the moon being the vessel through which everything is born, the moon representing mother. Since we have to start with the mother, we need to find a sign in the zodiac that fits the characteristics of the moon. So what are those things? Well, we know that the moon is cold and moist. So we need to find the sign that's cold and moist. We know that the moon is phlegmatic. So we need to find a sign that's phlegmatic. And these terms, cold and moist and phlegmatic, these are the terms that our traditional astrology is built on. This temperament, or this complexion of the planets. Every planet has a dual nature. Some planets are hot and dry, some planets are hot and wet, some planets are cold and moist, some planets are cold and dry, in the same way as our 4 elements have those same designations, and in the same way as all of the signs of our zodiac are also having those same designations. So that being said, we have the moon being cold and moist, being feminine, being the universal significator of mother in general, being phlegmatic, another classical designation, being married to the sun, which is a big deal with the moon, because if we have the moon as being mother, the sun must be father. So we have the moon also being married to the sun, and we have the moon, if we were to read Ptolemy, we have the moon taking some part in the production of heat based on the relationship and the marriage that the moon has with the sun. So all of these characteristics needed to be characteristics of wherever we placed the moon in, or whichever sign of the zodiac we called the temple of the moon. Therefore, we look and we see Cancer having all of those qualities. Cancer is a water sign. Therefore, Cancer is cold and moist, as is the moon. Cancer is phlegmatic, as is the moon. Cancer is feminine, as is the moon. Cancer is having some participation in the production of heat, as does the moon. Now, how does that occur? That occurs because Cancer, though being a cold and wet, phlegmatic water sign of the night, is the beginning of the summer. So it's as if the heat or the spark of fire within Cancer isn't as extraordinarily brilliant as the blazing fire that we find in Leo, but the fire is still there being held within the womb of Cancer, which eases us into the summertime after the spring, as opposed to it just being the end of spring and then summer in its full glory. We get this easing in, represented by Cancer holding that initial spark of the summertime within her womb before we enter the fullness of the sun in its glory in the middle of summer, which would be with Leo. So we find a similarity between Cancer and between the moon for all of these reasons combined. Because we could say, well, hey, Pisces has those same similarities, but Pisces doesn't necessarily have some participation in heat or some participation in holding the spark of heat in the same way as Cancer does, as being the first sign of the beginning of our summertime. And neither does Scorpio, even though Scorpio is having the rulership of Mars. Scorpio, being the middle of the fall, doesn't have that same relationship to heat that Cancer does, because Scorpio is essentially the middle of the season that we call cold and dry, fall being a cold and dry season. So neither of these two candidates of Pisces or Scorpio were able to hold this concept of lunar life in the same way as Cancer is. So for those reasons, Cancer is designated as the temple of the living creature, which is the moon, period. Now, after we've established a place for Cancer, we also have to establish a place for the sun, or rather, after we've established a temple for the living creature that is the moon, we also have to establish a temple for the living creature that is the sun. And so in the same way as we've designated Cancer as being the house or the temple of the moon, we look for the same characteristics in Leo, and we say, well, the sun is hot and dry. Leo is hot and dry. The sun is choleric, also being hot and dry, and Leo is also choleric. The sun is representing heat in its most dignified, glorified way, and Leo, being the middle of the summer, is also representing the highest climax or the highest culmination of the heat of the sun in its most dignified, glorified way. Leo is a diurnal. The sun is the diurnal luminary. The sun is in charge of the daytime. Leo is masculine, the sun is masculine. So we see these parallels occurring between Leo and the sun, which causes Leo to be the supreme temple for the living creature that we call the sun, in much the same way as we have Cancer being the greatest temple for the living creature that we call the moon. So we've established a place for mother and father. We've established the temples of the two luminaries. And we've established from that place a place for the rest of this concept to unfold, because we first established where the luminary should be placed. Now, in this Chaldean order of the planets, we have Saturn here being furthest planet moving outward from the sun, but we also have Saturn here being furthest planet moving outward from the moon. So from both these perspectives, Saturn is furthest from the moon as well as furthest from the sun. And it's for that reason why we have already established our primary oppositional system within our zodiac, because here we have the home or the domicile of the sun in Leo being furthest from Aquarius And we know that it's furthest because we know that they have a 180-degree relationship. And we also have the home or the domicile of the moon being furthest from the home or the domicile of Saturn, again, being Capricorn. When I came into astrology, this was initially a great conundrum for me because I couldn't understand for the life of me why Saturn appeared twice. It's a blessing that when I came into astrology through a more traditional perspective. So I never, for many years, interacted with an astrology where Uranus was the ruler of Aquarius. It was always this doubling of Saturn, which was never really quite comfortable for me. But as I reflected on it, and as I also began to read some of the works of the ancients, I understood this. And it's all based on this, that Saturn is furthest from the moon, and therefore the domicile or the home of Saturn is here furthest from the moon, because we know that Cancer is in opposition to Capricorn. But similarly, for the same reason, Saturn is furthest planet moving outward from the sun. And for that reason also, we have Saturn here being furthest planet moving outward from the sun. So what I initially thought was a mistake on the part of the ancients, and I mean, I started astrology when I was 12 years old. So of course, when you're 12 years old, starting a very advanced subject, you feel as if you're the smartest person in the world. So what I thought was a mistake for the ancients ended up being an expression of an internally elegant system of thinking that they had that was unbeknownst to me at the time. Because what we see in this first of the oppositions within the zodiac is something that for them represented the most fundamental of truths, that Saturn is furthest from the moon and Saturn is also furthest from the sun. So for that reason, Saturn is having the beginning of winter as well as the middle of winter. Now, if we step back a bit, winter is the part of the year, if we reference Guido Bonatti, winter is the part of the year most associated with destruction. The beginning of the year, the springtime, is associated with generation. Then we move on to the summertime, which is associated with preservation. Then we move on to the fall time, which is associated with corruption. And we move into the winter, which is associated with destruction. Now, this is the normal cycle of life. In the 21st century, we don't like to talk about destruction because we feel as if, oh, why would I talk about destruction? But these are the parts of life. These are the changes that we all go through. We all live, then our life is preserved, then we grow old, which is associated with the corruption portion of the year, and then we die, which is associated with the destruction portion of the year. And if you subscribe to the concept of reincarnation, we get reborn again in the springtime of yet another life. So these are harmonies that exist within nature, you see? And so for that reason, Saturn, as being considered to be the most destructive of the ancient planets, i.e. the greater malefic, is the planet that was given dominion over both the beginning of the winter and the middle of winter, because we go from the tiny destruction at the beginning of winter into the deep heart of Saturnian coldness, the deep heart of destruction in the middle of winter that doesn't have not even the smallest glimmering of the return of life, if you do live in a part of the world where you get the opportunity to experience all four of the seasons in their full glory. And then after that, we go on to the end of winter, which ironically has Jupiter here as being the greater benefic, ruling Pisces, to shake off some of that old coldness of winter, to allow the benefic return of spring to commence. So it's interesting that the planet that rules the beginning and the middle of winter is this greater malefic, or this greater evil, quote unquote, evil planet, being Saturn, and that the planet that ultimately ends up being the one who represents the change from the heart of winter towards the beginning of spring is representing Jupiter, the greater benefic, who is also considered to be the savior or the benefactor or the god that redeems us or the god that saves us. So here we have Jupiter swooping in essentially to save us from the cold shackles of Saturn and to essentially commence the liberation that will be found in the springtime. So here's why we have Saturn being opposite to the two luminaries for all of the reasons that we just indicated. Now, while the piece I just said about Jupiter shaking off the cold shackles of winter in the sign of Pisces could also be relevant, from the perspective of the ancients, Jupiter was placed here because in the Chaldean order, after Saturn, we go to Jupiter, then we go to Mars, and we go to the rest of the planets. Now, once again, here's our Chaldean order: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, luminary, Venus, Mercury, luminary. So since we've already appropriated for ourselves a house for the sun and the moon, we know that the sun and the moon can't be here. And we know that the sun and the moon can't similarly be here, i.e. between Mars and Venus, because the sun and the moon are placed here. And because the sun and the moon are singular in their power as being the moon, ruler of the nocturnal sect, and the sun, ruler of the diurnal sect, they only have one house of heaven, or they only have one domicile, they only have one temple of a living creature that they belong to. So we don't have a daytime and a nighttime house for the moon, and we don't have a daytime and a nighttime house for the sun. Leo is both the daytime and the nighttime house for the sun. Cancer is both the daytime and the nighttime house for the moon. Now, we don't see this in the other planets, because in all of the other planets are having both a daytime house and a nighttime house. And this concept of daytime and nighttime is split between which of the signs are masculine, which of the signs are feminine. Because the feminine sign that a planet rules is going to be its nighttime house, and the masculine sign that a planet rules is going to be its daytime house. So here we have Saturn in feminine Capricorn because Capricorn is cold and dry, melancholic, ruling black bile, but most specifically because Capricorn is an earth sign, and the earth and the water signs are feminine. And therefore, wherever we go within this sequence, the earth and the water signs, with the exception of Cancer and Leo, are going to represent the nocturnal domiciles for specific planets. So here we have Capricorn as the nocturnal domicile of Saturn, and we have Aquarius as the diurnal domicile of Saturn. Here we have Sagittarius as the diurnal domicile or home of Jupiter, and we have Pisces as the nocturnal domicile of Jupiter. We have Scorpio as the nocturnal domicile of Mars, Aries as the diurnal domicile of Mars, Libra as the daytime sign of Venus, Taurus as the nighttime sign of Venus, Virgo as the nighttime sign of Mercury, Gemini as the daytime sign of Mercury, and as we said, the daytime and the nighttime sign of the moon is Cancer, and the daytime and the nighttime sign of the sun is Leo. And this is important stuff because this is the entire structure of our classical perspective of rulership. And this also takes us into the next consideration of planetary joys. Which planets find their joys within which of the celestial houses? And by celestial houses, I'm referring to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so if a planet is diurnal, it will find its celestial joy in a diurnal sign. If a planet is nocturnal, it will find its celestial joy in its nocturnal sign. So Saturn, as a diurnal planet, finds its joy, its planetary joy, in Aquarius, because Aquarius is the one of the two signs of Saturn that is the same as Saturn insofar as Aquarius is a daytime sign and Saturn is a daytime planet. Similarly, Jupiter is a daytime planet, is a diurnal planet, and therefore Jupiter has its diurnal domicile and therefore also its planetary joy in Sagittarius, because there is a similarity between the internal nature of Jupiter as a diurnal planet and the internal nature of Sagittarius as a diurnal temple for that Jupiter. Moving on, we have Mars as a nocturnal planet. Now, this is another discussion for another day as to why Mars should be nocturnal when obviously Mars is a masculine planet and all of these things. But be it resolved, Ptolemy, and amongst Ptolemy, the ancients, decided that Mars should be, and every time I say this thing of Mars should be, it makes it seem as if we are making a decision as to where Mars should be. But they found that the effects of Mars seemed to be far less malefic when Mars was in its nocturnal sign of Scorpio than in its daytime sign of Aries. Therefore, Mars in Aries gave Mars that much more firepower to burn your house down. Whereas Mars in Scorpio, Scorpio being a water sign and a nighttime sign, had the ability to cool down some of that youthful exuberance of that Mars and allow him to put the scissors and the matches down so that he doesn't destroy everything. So that is why for the ancients, they considered Scorpio to be the planetary joy of Mars, because Mars seemed to be less brutally harmful in Scorpio than when Mars is in Aries. And once again, I'm not talking about someone's personality who you know, because this is the biggest blockage that we have in our astrology today. You hear an astrological concept and the first thing you want to do is superimpose it upon the personality of someone who you know who has the signature. And that's not the way to think. We have to step back and take a meta approach to our astrological conception of the cosmos and then move inward from there, still from a detached place, but to then move inward from there and to transplant these concepts onto people. But we have to first understand these concepts as forces of nature before we bring them into our personal sphere. Moving on, we have the Venus having its daytime domicile in Libra, Libra being a daytime sign because Libra is an air sign, and the air signs and the fire signs are masculine and also diurnal. And Venus happens to be a nocturnal planet. Therefore, of the two domiciles of Venus, Venus prefers to be in Taurus than she prefers to be in Libra. Once again, it doesn't matter who you know who has Venus in Libra or Venus in Taurus. This is of no consequence because we're talking big metasphere before we bring it down into our personal atmosphere, which is a skill that we should have. And then moving on, ultimately, we have Mercury having its planetary joy in Virgo. I'm sorry, I paused. I'm not used to seeing Virgo drawn like that. But we have Mercury having its planetary joy in Virgo. And we have the other domicile of Mercury being Mercury in Gemini. Now, this is something that a lot of people find as a conundrum because they say, well, hey, I thought that Mercury was androgynous, Mercury neither being masculine nor feminine, but both. How can we give Mercury a planetary joy or a zodiacal joy anywhere if Mercury is neither diurnal nor nocturnal? He is diurnal with the diurnal planets, nocturnal with the nocturnal planets, diurnal in a diurnal sign, nocturnal in a nocturnal sign, malefic with the malefic planets, benefic with the benefic planets. How can we give anything to Mercury at all? Well, the ancients found that Mercury seemed to function better when in Virgo than how Mercury functioned when in Gemini. And we have to think about this for a second in a way that's partly mythological, but also a way that's primarily logical. Mercury is considered to be the messenger of the gods, which means that there's already something fleet-footed about Mercury. There's already something that is constantly on the move about Mercury. And even when Ptolemy speaks about the characteristics of Mercury and why Mercury is as Mercury is, we get a certain mercurial nature of Mercury. This whole concept of things being mercurial is a Mercury word, and mercurial means constantly changing. Mutable is a synonym for mercurial, and mutable is also having the same meaning of constantly changing. So we have this constantly changing piece when it comes to our understanding of Mercury. And as a result of that constant change over there that the Mercury is having, we can deduce from the perspective of our own logical assessment of the cosmos and within the context of our nature-based philosophy, that fleet-footed Mercury would do far better in his domicile that belongs to the earth than in his domicile that belongs to the air, because the air only further amplifies this internal instability that is to be found there within Mercury in the first place. That instability being represented by the mutable nature of Mercury, the mercurial nature of Mercury, the constantly shifting nature of Mercury, the constantly moving nature of Mercury. So if we're wanting Mercury to truly be most benefic, and I put it in air quotations because there's that concept of the benefic Mercury has layers, but whatever. If we are to consider Mercury to be most benefic, then we consider Mercury to be most benefic when Mercury is functioning within a sign, within its sign, that has the ability to ground it and stabilize it and bring it down to earth. Which is why the Mercury in Virgo is where Mercury is having its planetary joy, even though we can't call Mercury a naturally diurnal planet or a naturally nocturnal planet. The Mercury in Virgo is having its planetary joy over there, as opposed to the Mercury in Gemini, because the Mercury in Gemini is too much already like the nature of Mercury for it to actually be helpful. Similarly, the Mars in Aries is too much likened to the nature of Aries for it to actually be helpful. And so we come up to this theory that says that even though a planet may enjoy certain circumstances, of course, Mars loves being in Aries, of course, Mercury loves being in Gemini. Even though a planet may enjoy certain circumstances, that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that that planet enjoys is going to be productive or useful or nutritive or life-sustaining for us, who are the recipients of these planets within the higher spheres. So this is why the Mercury is having not only its zodiacal joy in Virgo, but also its domicile as well as exaltation in Virgo, because of the ways in which Virgo, more than any other place that we can place Mercury, is the supreme environment for Mercury to function, for it to be most effective. Now, this brings us over to our final slide. But before we go to our final slide, the whole point is that within an astrological cosmology built upon these harmonies that exist within nature, nowhere within this have we found a lacuna, a hole, or a gap within which we can implant Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And that's the important part, because this is a sealed system. The concept of the Thema Mundi is probably one of the first concepts that is absolutely hermetically sealed on all sides, insofar as it allows no concessions in terms of other planets coming in to rule the system, which means that any of the other planets that we do find are outside of the system, not necessarily against the system, but they exist outside of the system as planets that may still be very important and still be very impactful. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are very impactful. People hate me when I say this, but Chiron is very impactful. You have Venus square Chiron in your chart and tell me how your life is and tell me how you feel about the nature of things. You know, for me, Chiron is the equivalent of a baby Saturn. So a very tight Chiron luminary situation or a very tight Chiron anything situation, for me, really an angular Chiron, Chiron with the sun, Chiron with the moon, Chiron with Mercury, Venus, whatever, is a Chiron that's worth noting in some way, because Chiron, for me, operates like a baby Saturn in a lot of regards. So I am in no way opposed to this concept of the ever-expanding sky of our astrology, because I continue to hold to this day that our astrology should fit the universe. The universe shouldn't be forced to fit our astrology. So we know that this is the Thema Mundi, a hermetically sealed system of rulership within classical astrology, but that doesn't mean that everything else gets thrown away. Everything else is still valid. And I also can't say that because every single day is like something new is coming up. But other things are also valid, even if they don't fit within the system. And I feel as if it's a massive reductionism for us to think that the only way I can make Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Lilith, Maki, Hayameya, all the pieces of floating gravel that exist within outer space somehow relevant to my astrology is if I make it a ruler of something. And for me, this isn't the way to deal with those concepts. Now, moving on to the final presentation, or to the final part of the slide, which is just this. This is showing this relationship of Saturn and its two domiciles, one diurnal, one nocturnal, Saturn standing as ruler between both, Jupiter and its two domiciles, one diurnal, one nocturnal, and Jupiter standing as ruler and sovereign between both, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. This is a system that has the opportunity, or has the ability, to seem arbitrary upon first glances. But when we go through this step-by-step process of building the Thema Mundi from the Moon and the Sun outward, we find that, one, it's perfectly elegant in every way. Two, there's nothing arbitrary about it. And three, the placement of the planets within the system are all based on an internal body of inalienable truths about the structure of the universe from the ancient perspective that feeds into the placement of everything here. And that nothing is randomly placed here. Because if we were to be truthful in this giving of the planets as we discovered them to the signs of the zodiac, we would end up with Uranus ruling Aquarius, which already is an arbitrary thought, the thought that, oh, we need to find a place of imbalance within the zodiac, which is the only reason why Uranus got Aquarius in the first place, because other astrologers in the year 1781 and later figured that, oh, this is really an imbalance, because they had no access to this additional knowledge. And so for that reason, we end up with Uranus being ruler there. And if we continue this, we would end up with Neptune being the ruler of Pisces, as many people do say that Neptune is, which I have no opinions of, and you know the reason why. But we would ultimately end up with Pluto being the ruler of Aries. And when Pluto was discovered in the year 1930 by Percival Lowell and the other young astronomer who discovered Pluto with Percival Lowell in 1930, the astrologers initially did think to put Pluto as the ruler of Aries. And there was actually a vote to the effect of Pluto being the ruler of Aries. But I think there is something within our internal astrological heritage that revolted against the thought. And so today, thank gods, we have Mars still being the ruler of Aries. And I shouldn't say so today we have Mars being the ruler of Aries because in 1930 if the astrologers had chosen otherwise, then it wouldn't be. No. But today, in our general conception of astrology, Mars is still the ruler of Aries because something said to someone somewhere that, hey, you know, we've gone too far. It's like that quote in the book of Job, hitherto thou hast come but no further. So yeah, sure, let me fap around with Aquarius, let me fap around with Pisces, but you know, Pluto doesn't really belong there. And so Pluto ended up getting put down here, which is an arbitrary consideration. Because if our thought was, as we find new planets within the cosmos, they will replace this double rulership situation, then Pluto should very much be the ruler of Aries. And I happen to know astrologers who do think that Pluto is the ruler of Aries, to which I have no actual comment. But hopefully, none of you here are that person, persons, plural, and hopefully you would have gained something from this discussion. I mean, it wasn't much of a discussion, it was much of a monologue, but hopefully you would have gained something from this presentation today. And, you know, if you still feel as if Uranus rules Aquarius and Neptune rules Pisces and the Pluto rules Aries, then, you know, astrology is big enough to hold space for all of us. But, you know, we should know where concepts come from in astrology. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we don't have within astrology today, this greater overarching understanding on the part of astrologers as to why our astrology is built in the shape that it's built. And if we had that, it doesn't necessarily say we'd all end up being traditional astrologers, but if we had that, we would have far more grounded reasons for why things are the way they are, other than our specific experiences about those things, which, while our experiences are valid, our experiences aren't the entire story. And the entire story is that we're actually talking about the cosmos. We're not just talking about people. So that is it. Any questions, queries, concerns, complaints? You could give me a complaint, because I'm not of the persuasion that we all are of the same agreement. But any questions, queries, concerns, complaints at this moment about this?
So thank you so much for including me. I've been loving on recently the sun and the moon each having a fire and water, and then each planet out from there being given rulership of two opposing qualities.
Mm-hmm.
Each of their qualities is opposite to each other. And so I've been seeing that the transmission that's been coming to me lately is that every planet, it's like the space that we carved out for them in the zodiac. You know, we invented the zodiac. I mean, this is a projection. This is, in my humble opinion, it's like this is the co-creation with the living universe that we're still cooking with. And you can make up different stories, you know. I'm not going to stand in anybody's way. But I just like this idea has been sticking out to me, of each planet being given dual rulership, representative of like duality rising out of the 0 point. And so it's almost like this is a frame that we did that helps us give meaning and relationship to that. And so totally with the outer planets. I mean, it's hard to not see their relationships, though. I mean, so many humans have been cooking with this for a while that it's like it's got power by itself. Just what's in the noosphere about it, you know.
Definitely. This concept of the duality arising out of the singularity of the 0 point or the monad is something that's really important to me. And it's also something that I teach at Oraculos, because what we find is that the ancients, and particularly the ancient Hermeticists, they had this internal awareness of the monad as being both the creator of itself and the destruction of itself, and therefore having duality already within its own body. And then the part that wanted to rule over that singularity pulled itself away, and therefore we have the duad. And the primary duad is sun and moon, or rather moon and sun. And also the other thing is, with the Thema Mundi, it's interesting because it starts with the moon and then goes to the sun. And in the ancient Hermetic cosmology about, you know, how things came into being, it starts with the moon, and then it goes to this active masculine progenitor force. You know, in the Bible, it says, in the beginning, the world was without form and void, and the Spirit of the Lord moved against the deep waters, and there was darkness across the face of the deep, and all of this. But there's this thought that this deep water, this deep, dark water, was the primordial pre-cosmos that this external masculine solar influence worked itself on. But the initial ground of being is this lunar ground of being, which is essentially the monad, the 0 that gives birth to the multiplicity. And we see this coming up as well in the Tao Te Ching, this whole concept that the singularity gave birth to the duality, and then the duality gave birth to the 10,000 things. And it's the same thing that we see here within our conception of the zodiac. So thank you for sharing that, because it's a very important point. Kulan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I have a complaint, not for you, Mychal, but for the ancients. My primary complaint is in this system that has such like an integrity of this equality between the balance of nocturnal and diurnal, of having each planet have both of those rulerships to really, complete that balance. I see throughout this entire system such incredible symmetry. And the one place where that deviates from me is the gender of Saturn. And with the gender of Saturn being feminine, the entire system returns to perfect equality and symmetry. And that's so beautiful to me, and it makes so much sense. So that's my critique of the my complaint with the ancient system.
Okay, that is a wonderful topic. So regarding the gendering of Saturn, it's not something that has not been asked before, and it's also not something that has been stated before. And from a Kabbalistic perspective, Saturn does receive the sphere that makes it feminine. So from a Kabbalistic perspective, Saturn is essentially that pre-cosmic dark water that the incoming spirit of Elohim works himself on. So there is this concept of Saturn as being the dark womb. But here we find a peculiar androgyny even within that concept of Saturn, because our overarching concept of Saturn is Saturn, male god who chews up his children because he doesn't want to be overthrown because of some prophecy. That's our one concept of Saturn. But then this other concept of Saturn as dark womb, Saturn as dark ocean, is also one that ties Saturn very deeply in to a larger feminine principle. Saturn has always, for the ancients, been the god of the sailors, the mariners, and boat captains. Basically, Saturn has been a god of occupations on the sea. And this is something that had always been a bit curious for me, because I was like, how could that be the case? But then, as I juxtaposed my astrology against my larger Hermeticism and against my larger study of Kabbalah, I realized, of course, Saturn would be the god of the deep, dark ocean, because Saturn is associated with Binah within the Kabbalistic framework. And I'm sure there are other reasons why Saturn is the god of the ocean from the perspective of the ancient astrologers that aren't just that. Now, the other thing in relation to the Saturn situation is that where Saturn falls, and I'm going to bring back up the diagram, where Saturn falls within this Thema Mundi is essentially here on the outskirts of everything, you see? And so for us, as we looked up at Saturn, Saturn was the god that maintained the stability and the security of our Earth life. And where was our Earth life? Our Earth life was located down below. So Saturn seemed to be the god within whom was entrusted the stability of our Earth experience. And so Saturn and Earth have always been interchangeable according to the ancients. Saturn and Earth, it's always been an interchangeable duality. Not even duality, it's always been an interchangeable unity, that Saturn is this material world. But at the same time, this material world is mother. So it's peculiar, because if we only know one part of the story, Saturn, male god, chews up his children. Well, he didn't actually chew up his children. He swallowed them whole. He would have had to swallow them whole because they were vomited whole. Anyway, that's beside the point. But the point is that if we think about Saturn as being this male god who swallows his children, then we get stuck within a very masculine perspective of Saturn. But if you think about Saturn as Sheila Nagig, who opens her legs and spreads her legs and pulls back into her body all people and the souls of the departed so that they can be reconstituted into her body, this concept of Saturn swallowing his children takes on a very particularly feminine bent. If we think about Saturn as the destroyer, the farmer who lops down the grain and therefore cuts down the life force, and therefore Saturn as the grim reaper, we once again have this thought of Saturn as being masculine. But if we think about Saturn as being an expression of Kali, a goddess of destruction, a goddess who completely devours and kills and destroys so that everything can be reconstituted into her body, or so that we can return to that primordial darkness, which is maternal, then we see Saturn as also once again having this maternal nature. So the point is, our study should be so broad and so nuanced that when we hear something, we don't run the risk of falling into fundamentalism about those concepts. Saturn is man, moon is woman, you know? Because once again, from a Kabbalistic perspective, where the moon falls on the tree of life is actually masculine, and it represents a penis. So, I mean, we have to be broad in our understanding of not just the things pertinent to our astrology, but also the adjunct fields that also feed that astrology, so that we have a nuanced understanding. And of course, the newbie coming into astrology needs to hear Saturn, male god, swallowed his children, the end. Because a newbie, a neophyte entering a field, doesn't know how to handle multiplicity. You know, you might learn something at your advanced level of astrology that's very different from what you learned at the beginning of astrology. In the beginning of astrology, you learned 1 + 1 is 2. At your advanced level of astrology, you learn 2 + 2 is 4. And we shouldn't try to enforce upon a person who only has the ability to understand 1 + 1 is 2, a reality where 2 + 2 = 4, because it's too much information. So of course, this information had to get packaged. Saturn, male. Mars, male, but nocturnal, even though still not female. Venus, benefic. But in some cultures, when Venus rose before the sun in the daytime and when Venus was the morning star, they shut their windows, because Venus as a morning star was thought to be a malefic, a destroyer, which is why on Aleister Crowley's tarot card of adjustment, which represents Libra, i.e. Venus, it has Venus holding a sword. And he calls her Venus girthed with a sword, because the Venus morning star is Venus the destroyer, whereas the Venus evening star is Venus the benefic. But which raw beginner can handle such multiplicity within themselves? You see? Yes, Kulan?
I guess I feel like receiving that initial mythology of the, you know, father eating his children and father overthrowing father and all of that stuff is really great, because you get a sense for how much of a patriarchal system we're inheriting. But I feel like when it comes down to like our core philosophy around this kind of stuff, if we just said Saturn is feminine, but also malefic, so we need to put Saturn in a diurnal sign to contrast that, for me, that makes a lot of sense. And Saturn being cold and dry, relating to Earth, like you said, being cold and dry, philosophically falling in a yin or feminine element, I feel like ultimately in my idealized world of it, that could be a simple switch such that we could just say, you know, Saturn is feminine if that's the context we're working in, or yin in the context we're working in. And then, oh, also, by the way, you should know about this father god situation. But anyway, I'll jump off my whole my whole fixation on this.
Well, my final point, and then Adam, I want you to say your point. But my final point is, you know, probably that's why Saturn has been so miserable for the past eons, because he's been misgendered. And, you know, maybe you have the antidote, but I'm not sure how fast it will catch on. The best we can ever hope to do is to know the basics, and after we've grown in those basics, receive nuance, the nuance being that everything is both. You see? Which is why the talk I'm giving in Atlanta literally next week is called The Redemption of the World Through Mercury, because Everything is both. And Mercury is the only planet that has the ability to stand in that both and position. Everything else is dichotomized. You have the sun, you have the moon, and then it's downhill from there. But Mercury is the only planet that has the ability to stand in that gap, which is why my larger working thesis is that our astrology, or the aim for all of us who practice a mystical practice, whether it's astrology, whether it's Kabbalah, whether it's whatever, is to become like Mercury. Because to become like Mercury is to essentially be able to handle the dichotomies of heaven and hell within ourselves without showing or having any real allegiance to either. But that's another topic for another day. Adam, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going ahead and typing it in. I'm just geeking out on elements in the zodiac lately, and just getting into Ptolemy and rereading the Tetrabiblos and connecting some elemental dots that we don't usually get too into. But just seeing that I think our expressions of masculine and feminine that we're used to, usually we think of the diurnal signs as masculine and the nocturnal signs as feminine, but I really see the expression more being the wetness being more feminine, which is about inclusion and acceptance of the water and air, about our emotions and acceptance of longer cycles and connection and communication. And then the masculine being fire and earth, the dry of separating out, doing it, making it happen. Don't need more talking about this, we need more doing about this. Yeah. So in the usual conceptions. But if you look at the dry and the wet, it's like they're equal rulerships of signs of dryness and wetness in terms of the planetary expression. So it's like it's balanced in both those ways.
Definitely.
So last thought about that with Ptolemy, his idea, the east being dryness and the west being wetness, and above the horizon being hot and below the horizon being cold. So the houses are different than the way our zodiac's laid out. Because it ends up with fire being the midheaven, water being down below, the earth being the east, and the water being the west. And so that it's just kind of another cool harmony to play with, to think about, and with the house structures.
Definitely.
So, anyway, yeah, it was just weird to see that, because I always think of, there's that Thema Mundi idea, and then a lot of people put Aries in the first house, and but fire is the midheaven and earth is the ascendant. That's what's been like what I've been seeing with clients in person. It's like, oh, interesting. So thank you so much for the invitation to come and check out your ideas, and thank you everybody for sharing and letting me pop in.
I just want to say thank you all to everyone. And thank you for being here, and thank you for being willing to be in this space and at least hear, even if you do have difference of opinions, but to hear where these thoughts come from within our tradition. And hopefully it has shed some light on astrology for you, regardless of whatever you're going to take away from this. And at the end of the day, stepping down off of the very high horse that traditional astrology oftentimes can be, which isn't often the most helpful horse to be on. Two of the greatest astrologers I can think of in the world are modern astrologers, and I'm deeply staggered by their work. And I am deeply floored by what they have done and what they've created and what they've accomplished. The two of them are Christine Skinner. Christine Skinner is someone who I think is literally one of the greatest astrologers of our time. And the next one, who I know she'd be surprised for me to even call her name, the next one is Faith McInerney. And Faith McInerney and Christine represent, for me, the highest caliber of astrological practice and the highest caliber of astrological client work. And they're both modern astrologers. They've never seen the Thema Mundi in their life. They don't know a thing about, nothing about no essential dignities, but they are bomb-ass at what they do. And for Christine and Faith, Uranus rules Aquarius, and Pluto rules Scorpio. And what's the next one? And Neptune rules Pisces. And they will die on that cross, and their astrology is magic. So, who's right? is the question, which brings up the other question, do any of us have to be right? And I think that that's a really important consideration as well, because if our astrology has taught us anything at all, it has taught us that it is versatile and it is flexible to hold all of us, regardless of what our beliefs or practices are in relation to that astrology. So I like to view astrology as being holographic. And with a holograph, no matter which section of the holograph you cut off, that section contains the entire system. So whether you cut off the modern section or the traditional section or whatever section, whatever cross section of the hologram, you still end up with the entire system intact within it. And I feel as if your astrology is giving you the ability to practice and to practice extraordinarily within the lives of others. And if you've identified no lack within the body of your astrology and your astrology hasn't come up short for you, and you hold within yourself views that may not necessarily be the same as mine or may not necessarily be the same as anyone's, but they work and they work radically well for you, then I think that you should stick with that. Some people use Placidus houses, some people use whole sign houses, some people use porphyry, some people use Regiomontanus, some people use no houses at all, some people just use
equal houses. Sorry.
Some people use equal houses, like it's like the whole of the UK. Well, not the whole of the UK, but a lot of the UK uses equal houses because that was one of the initial things that was established by the Astrological Association and the work of Margaret C. Hone. So, I mean, who's right? All of us have had clients for years. All of us practice great astrology. And I think that if you're good, then stay in that goodness. But if you feel as if there's something else that you're looking for, or there's something else that you're missing, or you want to understand the reason why, there's no other place to turn to other than antiquity. Because in antiquity, they wrote books dedicated to just why. Not even books on how to practice astrology, but books dedicated to just why is this astrology built this way? And that's a wonderful set of hands to be held in. Hands that know, or hands that have at least spent hundreds of years thinking before they gave us an answer, as opposed to someone who just thought about something yesterday when they were sitting on the toilet and figured that, oh, this is now the truth. So thank you all for being here. And I definitely have enjoyed sharing space with you.